women are killed in that fire. So it highlights the issue of poor conditions for women. It's a factory fire, which highlights the poor conditions for labor in factories at the time. And the fact that they're jumping out of the 9th floor of a building because they have no alternative highlights the problems associated with building construction in the late 19th century, that there were no fire escapes, there were no fire exits. As a matter of fact, the door to get out was locked because the managers didn't want the women sneaking off to take a smoke break. So they locked the doors from the outside, which is so. So the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire is usually the event that people look at, definitely College Board looks at, as the event that kind of encapsulates women issues, labor issues, building construction issues, and highlights the need for zoning laws, maximum occupancy regulations, sprinkler systems, fire escapes, better working conditions, better pay, better treatment of workers. A lot of that reform comes out of the problems associated with Triangle Shirtwaist or a number of other fires that took place in major cities. The problem in the cities was that the cities were run by bosses. They were run by political machines, like Boss Tweed, Tammany Hall in New York City. That's kind of the example that a lot of people use. These political bosses were corrupt. They maintained power. Their main goal was to remain in power because that's how they made money. And they made money off of all the building contracts that they were getting as the cities were growing. So immigrants come into a city. You need more roads, more bridges, more city halls, more schools, more police, more fire. You need more to service all these people. That requires building. It requires money. It requires construction. And the government doesn't build things. The government hires companies to go out and build these things for them. So what the political machines would do, like Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall was a building in New York City. What they would do is they would tell a contractor, we need a new city hall. And the contractor would come back, and a number of construction companies would come back, and they would say, all right, we can build your city hall for this much. We can build your city hall for that much. We can build your city hall for that much. And normally what happens is the government takes the lowest bid. That's how it's done today. Back in the late 19th century, what would happen is the construction contractor would say, I can build that city hall for this much. And if you give us the contract, we'll give you, the political machine, a percentage of the profit that we make on it. And that is what is called a kickback. Now, if you give the money to the political machine right up front and say, here's $50,000, give us the contract, that's a bribe. If you give them money on the back end, that's called a kickback. Today, both of them are illegal. But back in the day, that's how business got done in these major cities. That's how a lot of these construction contracts got done. And then what the political machines would do is they would take the money that they earned off the bribes, the kickback, the other corruption and graft. If the technical term is graft. They would take the money that they earned off the graft and they would use it to go around to the immigrant groups and give them aid. Here's some money to help you out. Here's money to help you get an apartment. Here's money to help you get shoes. Here's money to help you get clothes. Here's money to help you get food. And they would play on the needs of the immigrants to then maintain their power because the immigrant would vote for the political machine. Hey, I'm not interested in democracy. The mayor gave me shoes. And that's how political machines maintain their power using immigrants. It's why a lot of political reformers at the turn of the century who are looking to clean up corruption in government also were in favor of immigration reform and immigration restrictions because they saw immigrants as a source of the problem. The thing that brought down Boss Tweed were political cartoons. Like the one that you saw on the county assessment, the big fat guy standing there next to the ballot box that said, "In counting there is strength." That was a political cartoon from a guy named Thomas Nast. And Nast was like the preeminent political cartoonist of his day. There were a number of people. Joseph Kepler was another one. I tend to like Kepler's cartoons. But Thomas Nast is the one they always ask about on the test. You always see a Thomas Nast cartoon, or Thomas Nast was responsible for. Thomas Nast, through his cartoons, was responsible for highlighting the corruption of Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall. And in actuality, Boss Tweed wound up with his remaining days in jail for corruption. He was arrested for corruption. And that was due in large part to Boss Tweed. But the cartoons were to try to spread the information as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Thomas Nast would be considered a good example of a muckraker. A muckraker was a journalist or someone who was interested in exposing a problem. Think about a muck rake. Okay, you've got leaves there and stuff. You take the muck rake and you rake it up and you look at all the dirt and the mud and the muck underneath. That's what the muckraker journalists were doing. They were exposing the problems of society, like Boss Tweed and these political machines, or the problems associated with monopolies, big oil, big steel, the problems associated with labor. A lot of muckraking journalists would write stories about abusive business practices or abusive political practices. And it would bring it to the attention of an ever-growing literate population. And the people would read these stories or look at these cartoons, and John and Mary Q middle class would sit there and go, well, shouldn't we do something about that? Shouldn't the government try to fix these problems? Shouldn't the government be honest? Shouldn't factories be built to a certain standard? Shouldn't businesses not be allowed to dominate an entire industry? And what you start to have over 30 years is a buildup to this attitude of progressivism. The willingness to use the government, clean government. You got to clean the government up first. Clean and honest government can be used to fix people's problems. So the Gilded Age represents the problems. Progressivism represents the solutions. In terms of politics in the late 19th century, these are a lot of forgettable presidents. And pretty much all of them, even Cleveland, I know he's a Democrat, but really there was very little difference between the Republicans and the Democrats in the late 19th century. I know the South always voted Democrat because they remembered Reconstruction, so the solid South always voted Democrat. But what wound up happening in all the presidential elections between 1876 and, let's say, 1900 was that the Republicans would get 51% of the vote and the Democrats would get 49% of the vote. So it was very evenly matched. But the Republicans always seemed to have a little bit more of an advantage. So presidents like Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Cleveland, Harrison, and to an extent McKinley are generally forgettable presidents. There's a reason why you don't see their names on dollars and on cents. We are mediocre presidents. You won't find our faces on dollars or on cents. There's Tyler, there's Taylor, there's Fillmore, and there's Hayes. There's William Henry Harrison. I died in 30 days. Yeah, that's it. That was my master's thesis. I went in there to the board of professors and say, yeah, there you go. There's my little song and dance. Now, give me my diploma, please.
I read about the assassination of Garfield.
Yeah, and did you read, what was the book? I read it 2 summers ago. What's the name of the book?
Probably haven't read it.
Okay. You've read about the assassination. I read an entire book on the assassination of Garfield, and it is a fascinating story. Hold 2 seconds and let me get there. The only thing you need to know, and I'll just tell you what you need to know. The only thing you need to know about Rutherford B. Hayes is the election of 1876 and how screwy that was, and how you had the compromise of 1877. Remember, Tilden won the popular vote? And then Hayes won the electoral vote because of the Electoral Commission. And then the deal was Hayes would be president and Reconstruction would come to an end. The only other thing you need to know about Hayes is that Hayes used troops to break up the railroad strike of 1877. There was a nationwide railroad strike. The railroad workers were trying to unionize, and they went on strike because of their bad working conditions. And rather than acquiesce to the needs and the demands of the railroad workers, Hayes sent out federal troops because he believed that the railroad strike was a disruption to national security. Literally to make sure the mail got through. So those are the only 2 things you need to know about Hayes. Hayes promised to be a 1-term president, and he kept to his promise. He was a 1-term president. He did not want to run for re-election. Garfield, the one thing you need to know about Garfield is that he was killed. He was elected in 1880 to try to, the big issue in 1880 was civil service reform. People were frustrated by the fact of the spoils system. And if you remember, going all the way back to Jackson, the spoils system, you reward loyal political followers with government jobs, and what you wind up with is a government filled with incompetent people who don't know what they're doing. The only fact that they're there is that they helped out the president to get elected. Garfield wanted to change that. Garfield was, first of all, I believe he's the only minister who's ever been elected president. He was a minister. He was also a college professor. He was a brilliant man, spoke Latin. He was from Ohio, relatively young guy, very bright, very articulate. There was a lot of hope placed on James A. Garfield when he was elected to try to clean up the system and get people in government positions who were honest and who were qualified for their jobs. Garfield's main thing was he wanted to clean up the civil service system, the spoils system. And he winds up getting assassinated by a guy who thought he deserved a government job because he helped out Garfield in getting elected. So the assassination of Garfield in and of itself revealed the ultimate pinnacle of the corruption of the spoils system. Here was a guy who thought he was owed a job because he had helped out. Now, nobody had asked for his help. He was crazy. Charles Guiteau was an absolute nut job. And the reason why he was a nut job was he was born and raised in Oneida. Remember Oneida?
Yeah.
The silverware? Yeah. Charles Guiteau was born in Oneida. So he was part and parcel to all that craziness. And he was certifiable. And so he actually stalked Garfield to the train station at Union Station in Washington, D.C. Garfield was getting on a train to go to his college reunion in Ohio, and he was there with Robert Todd Lincoln, the harbinger of death. and was shot in the back. Now, he didn't die from the gunshot wound. He was shot in May. He died in July. So he lingered for 2 months. What killed him wasn't the gunshot. What killed him was the infection that he got. The doctors were trying to find the bullet, and they kept poking around in the gunshot wound in his back looking for the bullet. And the doctor who was working on him was convinced that the bullet was in one place. When they did the autopsy, they found the bullet was in a completely different spot. But the guy that they hired, and this is what I learned in this book, the guy that they hired to try to find the bullet, besides the doctor, because the doctor wasn't having any luck, they called up this guy who had just revealed his new invention at the 1876 centennial in Philadelphia. There was a World's Fair in Philadelphia in 1876, and this guy wasn't even going to bring his invention, wasn't even going to bring it. He thought nobody is going to want to deal with it. Nobody's going to want to look at this invention. I work with the deaf. I'm a teacher of the deaf, and I'm trying to work on devices that will help deaf people hear better because my mom is deaf. So I've invented this thing. Nobody's really going to care about it. Somebody convinced him to get a booth at the Centennial in 76 in Philadelphia. He got like the third to last booth in the last pavilion down at the end of the damn thing. And his name was Alexander Graham Bell. And it was the telephone. And Bell was an expert on electrical currents and sound. And he had invented the telephone initially to help his deaf mom. I think it was his mom. Maybe it was his wife. Mom or his wife. Some lady. But anyway, so they call up Bell and they're like, hey, Bell, you know about electronics and stuff like that. Can you help us out here? We're trying to find this bullet. So Bell comes along and he invents a device that has metal coils and wires wrapped around it with an electrical charge running through it that when you pass it over the person will detect the metal in the person. He invents the metal detector.
Wow.
Exactly. Well, and as a sidebar, since Garfield was lingering and couldn't get out of bed, and it was hot in the summertime in Washington, D.C., the Navy Department invented a device that was an electric fan that blew over ice blocks. Air conditioning. Yeah, air conditioning was invented. The metal detector was invented. All this because of the Garfield shooting. But Bell came in, and Bell ran his device over the president and couldn't find the bullet. He goes back to his lab. He's distraught. He doesn't know what's going on. He's got all these pig carcasses that he's firing bullets into and then passing the metal. And the metal detector picks up the bullets in the pig carcasses. They go back to the White House, second time, metal detector, running it over Garfield. The signal's scattering all over the place. Nobody knows what in the hell's going on here. Bell finally gives up. The doctors tell Bell, thanks for trying, see you later. Come to realize that the president is laying on a bed with a metal box spring, and so it scatters the signal. And so they could never find the bullet. The poor guy died of the infection from the doctors poking their fingers in the bullet hole. The man weighed 220 pounds when he was shot. He weighed 120 when he died. When they cut him open for the autopsy, his body was literally filled with pus. He was so infected. Anyway, as a result, moving on, as a result of the Garfield assassination, the next president, the vice president who takes over, Chester Arthur, Chester Arthur is going to sign a bill that is going to reform the civil service system in government. It's called the Pendleton Act, and it's always a test question because it represents a move forward. It represents progress. The idea behind the Pendleton Act, which was actually written by George Pendleton of Ohio, but it was signed by Chester Arthur. You have to pass a test in order to get a government job. If you cannot pass the test, you're not qualified for the job. You can't get that job. Guys, I'm a government employee. I had to pass a test to get this job. It is part of the Pendleton Act. There have to be qualifying exams for government jobs. Now, the ultimate irony of the fact is that Arthur himself, prior to becoming vice president, the job that he held prior to becoming vice president of the United States in 1880 was he was head of the New York City Customs House. Now, what does that mean to you? It doesn't mean anything. He was the guy. His responsibility in New York City, the largest port in America, his job was to collect duties on imports. It was his job to handle the money. And so, as head of the New York City Customs House, whenever imports would come in, they would go through Chet Arthur's office and they would pay their import duties. Remember, the Republicans are in favor of high tariffs to protect American goods. They would pay the tariff rates to Chet Arthur, and Chet Arthur would go, okay, tariff rate, yeah, there we go. Okay, tariffs are taken care of. Chet Arthur was an extremely wealthy man who got his money by stealing it. And yet, passes one of the most honest bills to come down the pike. And somebody asked Chet Arthur, they're like, it basically said, oh God, do I have the book here? I love that. Oh yeah. I love the story of Chet Arthur. Here's a guy who's as corrupt as the day is long, yet he becomes president of the United States, and it totally changes him. Here we go. The most significant achievement of the Arthur administration was the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883. The act provided for exams to establish the priority of federal job applicants rather than the spoils system of outright political patronage. It also prohibited federal job salary kickbacks to political party organizations. Arthur infuriated his political friends by signing this bill into law, even though he himself had benefited from the patronage system. It appeared that Arthur had undergone a transformation upon undertaking the presidential oath. When Arthur denied the request of one of his Republican Party favor seekers, the man protested that Arthur would be making a similar request were he in the same position. Arthur replied, quote, "I certainly would, but since I came here, I have learned that Chester A. Arthur is one man and the President of the United States another." The man grew in the office. All right, so Cleveland, 2 terms. What do you need to know about Cleveland? Cleveland, first term, the thing you need to know is that the 1884 election campaign was all about a sex scandal. Apparently, Grover Cleveland was a bachelor when he was elected in 1884. He was unmarried. And apparently, when he was a young man in the New York State legislature, had fathered a child out of wedlock which was verboten at the time. And so the Republicans had found that out in 1884, and the campaign slogan of the Republicans was, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" And there were cartoons of Grover Cleveland sitting there with a baby in his arms doing this, and he's got this crying baby going, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" Now, when Cleveland won the election, the Democratic rejoinder was gone to the White House. Ha, ha, ha. But that was the big issue in the Cleveland election. Now, Cleveland had been elected to be a reformer. He had promised to be a reformer. He was a reform mayor of Buffalo. He was a reform governor of New York. And that's how the Democrats won. They won the solid South, some farm states out west, and New York. And Cleveland promised to come in, continue cleaning up the patronage system, and he wanted to clean up the Civil War pension system. People were receiving Civil War pensions who had never fought in the Civil War. And the Republicans were using the pensions as political bribes to get support. And he said, "I'm cleaning that up." Yeah, but he had a Republican Congress he had to deal with, and so he couldn't get anything done. And so Cleveland's first term is generally considered to be a noble failure. He is thrown out of office in 1888 when Benjamin Harrison is elected. Now, the one thing Cleveland did in his first term was he left Harrison a surplus. He had a budget surplus. One of the few times we've had a budget surplus in this country. He left Harrison essentially a $1 billion surplus. Harrison comes into office, takes that $1 billion surplus, and starts giving out more Civil War pensions. As a matter of fact, blows the entire wad. Gone. It's called the $1 billion Congress, and they basically spent it all. As a matter of fact, the problem was Harrison spent the entire surplus and left a debt. And it was the economic policies of Harrison that led to the Depression of 1893. But Harrison was denied re-election in 1892. Grover Cleveland was re-elected in 1892, but Grover Cleveland comes into office and immediately is confronted with the depression that Benjamin Harrison left him. So the Democrat leaves the Republican a surplus, the Republican blows it all, and then a Democrat comes in and has to deal with the aftermath. Very familiar story. Bill Clinton left George Bush a $1.2 trillion surplus in 2000. George Bush promptly spent it all, and then some, and racked up about $4 trillion more in debt, and then created the economic problem, created the problems that led to the 2008 economic decline, which then the Democratic president has to come in and fix. Very familiar story. Let's see. So, all right. Politics. Tariff controversy. Republicans support a high tariff. It protects jobs. It enriches the rich. Democrats generally favor lower tariffs because it inspires more competition. There is a call for railroad regulation. We talked about railroad regulation with the farmers. Trusts. There is an issue with trusts. Trusts are monopolies. Trusts are business organizations that dominate an industry, whether it's oil or steel or banking or sugar or iron or whatever. You name it, and there are businesses that dominate that particular industry. And there were three big trust organization styles, which I want to show you. You're filming me.
follow along.
Andrew Carnegie was best known for what is known as vertical integration. That's how he dominated the steel industry. Nobody could compete, well, very few people could compete with Andrew Carnegie and U.S. Steel in the late 19th century because he owned the mines, he owned the railroads, he owned the steel mills, and he owned the shipping. He owned everything you needed to own in order to manufacture steel efficiently, from soup to nuts. Vertical integration. John D. Rockefeller dominated the oil industry through Standard Oil by buying up other oil companies. That's called horizontal integration, when you buy up other companies that do the same thing you do. So, for instance, Microsoft today buys up other software companies. Disney buys up other entertainment companies. That's called horizontal integration. You dominate the market. And then J.P. Morgan dominated banking by putting the same people on the boards of different banks. It's called interlocking directorates. But you had J.P. Morgan's people on the board of this bank, and that bank. And so while they technically looked like independent banks, they were really all run by J.P. Morgan. And so there were people who wanted to end that. Okay? Ida Tarbell wrote a book called The History of Standard Oil, which chronicled the corrupt business practices of John D. Rockefeller. Labor unions were upset with Carnegie's approach to labor. You had the Homestead strike in the 1890s. That was at Carnegie's steel mill. People were upset that J.P. Morgan seemed to dominate banking, to the extent that in 1907, when the stock market took a dive, President Teddy Roosevelt actually had to go to J.P. Morgan and beg for a loan. Can you imagine that today? Going to the banks today and begging for a loan to keep the government afloat? So there were people who wanted to end these unfair business practices. That's why you get the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. And it's not really used to break up monopolies until the Roosevelt administration. It's mainly used to break up labor unions as illegal combinations that impede trade. But the spirit is there to want to curb monopolies. Agrarian farmer discontent. I think we talked about this, right? Farmers upset. They're upset at the high tariffs because it cuts off their markets overseas. Overproduction of farm goods leads to a decline in prices, so farmers are finding it harder and harder to make a profit. The earnings slump. The railroads and banks, of course, take advantage of the farmers. The railroads charging exorbitant rates. The banks charging high interest rates on loans. Technology leads to overproduction. Barbed wire ends open range cattle. Fertilizer harvesters push prices high. It hurts farmers. Railroads control the price of transportation, which hurts farmers. Half the population of the country is farmers, and that's when they start to organize into the Grangers and the Farmers Alliances. Farmer groups demand reforms at the state level. They demand rail and banking regulations. The famous phrase was that farmers needed to raise less corn and more hell. Mary Elizabeth Lease, note noted farm advocate. The 1887 Interstate Commerce Act allows the government to regulate interstate commerce rates and railroads. The Sherman Antitrust Act ostensibly is supposed to regulate monopolies. The crisis of the 1890s, the farmer fights back. The populist part, we talked about the populist, right? The Omaha platform, okay? Demanding of the free coinage of silver, what's called bimetallism, inflated currency, more money available. They want a flexible currency. They want an income tax where the richest people are taxed at a higher rate. They want government ownership of utilities, but they'll settle for regulation of utilities like rail, like electricity, like telegraph. They want direct election of senators. They want term limits on the president. Guys, you get all that eventually. Eventually, you get all that. The Federal Reserve System is created in 1913. It creates a flexible currency. You get a graduated income tax in 1911, the 16th Amendment. You get direct election of senators in the early 1900s through the 17th Amendment. You get term limits eventually on the president, the 22nd Amendment in 1951. And you get more people having a say, initiatives and referendums, allowing people to put questions on the ballot, giving people more of a say. You eventually get all that. You just don't get it in the 1890s when the populists are in their heyday. And we talked about the election of 1896, Bryan versus McKinley. All right, next page. Industrial growth in America. Railroads, steel, oil, okay? Those are the three big areas where money is made. I would also add in there banking, and I would also add in there newspapers. News is big business in the late 1800s. Newspaper sales, okay? People are hungry for news. And who are the two big newspaper guys in the late 19th century? Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. And the way they sell newspapers is through blood, sex, and gore. Guys, it's how news is sold today. I mean, think about it. Are you going to sit there and watch a story about, the fiscal policy of the Fed and whether they're going to raise interest rates or not? Or are you going to watch the story about whether the Kardashians were caught on film again? Yeah, right. Okay. It's called yellow journalism, and it's exaggerated news. It's sensationalized headlines. And Pulitzer and Hearst corner the market on newspapers in that way by appealing to people's basest instincts. But railroad companies we talked about, steel I talked about, oil I talked about, Rockefeller. The government approach is laissez-faire, hands-off approach. They do not believe that the government does not believe that they should interfere with big business. That the business of America, to quote Calvin Coolidge, is business. Now, wealthy people had certain attitudes about wealth. For instance, Carnegie believed in what was called the gospel of wealth. He believed that rich people had a duty, since they had benefited, they had a duty to give something back to society to make society a better place. Now, that meant building schools, building libraries, building public parks, building theaters, building things that made society better. That's why you've got Carnegie Hall, Carnegie Mellon University, system of Carnegie libraries. The Carnegie Endowment today is still one of the largest endowments in the country. But this idea of the gospel of wealth, what we would call philanthropy, that the rich have a duty to make the society a better place for other people. That's the gospel of wealth. The other attitude of the wealthy is social Darwinism. We're rich, we're powerful because we evolved that way. Poor people are poor because that's what nature intends them to be. And so, therefore, that natural balance should not be disrupted through artificial government regulation. That just interferes with the natural selection. The rich will rise to the top and the poor will fall to the bottom, and that's the way nature intended it. That's social Darwinism. Um, in terms of industrialization and the effect on workers, businesses become depersonalized. People working in factories generally feel like cogs in a machine. It hurts creativity. Free enterprise farming is replaced by corporations. So, the mom and pop store or the artisan or the small-time farmer is replaced by large-scale corporations. The factory controls life, the whistle and artificial discipline. Workers become subservient. The Gibson girl, that was the popular vision of what women were expected to be in the late 19th century. If you've ever seen the Victorian style dress, where the woman is, covered from the neck all the way down to the ankle, woman reveals nothing. That's the idea. Charles Dana Gibson, he was an illustrator in the late 19th century, and he did a number of these cartoons which depicted women as being very prim and proper and conservative and stuff like that. There were women out there who challenged that. Margaret Sanger, Victoria Woodall. Margaret Sanger advocated that women should be more in tune with their bodies, that they should be, actually what Margaret Sanger advocated was birth control and family planning. Victoria Woodall, she was seen as the devil incarnate because she advocated for women's rights and what she called free love. So that ran counter to Victorian attitudes of women being prim and proper. That's what the Gibson girl is. 2/3 dependent on wage, unemployment not based on effort. Okay, so people are essentially becoming factory workers. Okay? And that's why you start to see in the late 19th century the union movement in America. Manual laborers, machines displace workers, corporations make labor organization impossible. There are 3 labor unions you need to be aware of. One is the National Labor Union. It is founded right at the end of the Civil War. It is a labor union that welcomes all workers. It is one big union of all workers. Doesn't matter what your job is, doesn't matter what your gender is, doesn't matter what your skill level is, doesn't matter what your race is. The National Labor Union welcomed men and women, blacks and whites, skilled and unskilled workers from all walks of life. That union failed. Why? What?
Well, you let anyone in. Not very many people are very smart.
Right. That's right. That's exactly it. You had a lot of unskilled workers in these labor unions who did not know how to organize, did not know how to run an organization. A lot of the unskilled workers generally tended to be more radical, more willing to use violence, and that turned a lot of people off. A lot of the unskilled workers tended to be socialists or communists or at the very least anarchists, and that turned people off. Plus the fact that when you've got a union made up of all different workers from all different walks of life, you can't get everybody on the same page. It's impossible to organize it. So the National Labor Union, while it was noble in its attempt, failed by the 1870s. It was supplanted by the Knights of Labor. Now, the Knights of Labor also was a union for all. Men and women were welcome, whites and blacks were welcome. The problem with the Knights of Labor is they were blamed for something called the Haymarket Riot in Chicago in 1886, I believe. There was a strike in Chicago. The Knights of Labor had organized it. There were a lot of foreigners in the Knights of Labor. A lot of immigrant workers who had come here, a lot of new immigrants come looking for work, joined the Knights of Labor, and a lot of them, they had some radical tendencies. What wound up happening was during this strike, one of the protesters apparently lobbed a bomb into the line of police officers, and it blew up, killing a number of police officers. The police officers then started opening fire on the workers. The workers then took their weapons and went after the police, and it turned into this big, huge melee in downtown Chicago. The American public blamed the labor union for it, and the Knights of Labor lost influence as a result. It's why in the 1890s you see the formation of something called the American Federation of Labor. This is a different type of labor union. It is a labor union for skilled men only. It is limited. You limit who can get in. It is only for skilled workers, workers with an education. Why?
They can organize it better.
Yes.
But is it does it discriminate based on race?
Yes. Blacks are not allowed. Women are not allowed. Unskilled workers are not allowed. As a matter of fact, the AFL also doesn't want immigrants either. They want English-speaking, skilled labor. They don't want radicals. They don't want immigrants. Because the AFL, founded by Samuel Gompers, is not interested in replacing capitalism with communism. They are interested in, 10 cents more an hour. They're interested in a 15-minute break in the middle of the morning. They're interested in incremental change, not radical change. It's what Gompers called bread and butter unionism. Bread and butter issues. A little bit more in your paycheck. A few more minutes of break time. Workplace safety. Those sorts of things. They're not talking about communist revolution. They're not talking about anarchy. Okay? So they're not radical. The AFL is not a radical union. Although, I will tell you, in the late 19th century, unions have that label of being radical organizations because a lot of strikes wound up turning violent. The railroad strike of 1877 wound up with gunfire and deaths. The Homestead strike in not the Homestead strike, the Haymarket riot in 1886 was a violent strike. The Homestead strike at Carnegie Steel Mill in 1892 turned violent. The Pennsylvania National Guard had to be called out. The Pullman strike in 1894, that was the railroad workers. Again, in 1894, Grover Cleveland had to call out federal troops to break it up, and it turned violent. So a lot of people, John and Mary Q. middle class sitting in their suburban house, reading their newspaper, eating their morning breakfast, drinking their coffee, are reading the news, and they're reading about these strikes, and they're like, oh my goodness, those union workers, they are just so radical. So there's not a lot of widespread support for unions in the late 19th century. And then you always have this question of whether the monopolists of the day are, this is an old chestnut in AP. Are they captains of industry or are they robber barons? To put it in modern parlance, are they job creators or are they corrupt thieves? It's a good question. It's a nice mental exercise because you could make the argument that Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan, through their investments, through their businesses, created jobs for thousands of people. That their job, that their work, that their innovation, whether in steel or oil or rail or banking or news or heavy industry or and think about anything that's mass produced. Okay? Anything and everything is mass produced in this country. By 1900, we are China. What China is today, we were in 1900. We made everything. Well, that raises the standard of living for everybody. So maybe there is some good there. But think about the monopolistic practices. Think about the government corruption and big business being in bed with government and all the bribes and the kickbacks for government to look the other way and not regulate big business. That's corrupt. That's unfair. The deck is stacked. You can't compete with these monopolies. You know, Horatio Alger argued that if you just worked hard and played by the rules, you too could be like Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie is the poster boy for the American dream. Andrew Carnegie came to America in the 1840s with $8 in his pocket from Scotland. He got a job working at a steel mill in Pittsburgh, sweeping broom. That's how he got started. And by 1900, he sold U.S. Steel to J.P. Morgan for $1 billion.
Good morning, Southern High School. Your announcements will be on shortly.
So, I mean, there is something to be said about that American dream. But guys, Andrew Carnegie is one guy. We're talking about millions of people. And you're going to have to create a system whereby more people have opportunities. That's what the progressives are going to do.
February 7th, 2014, a B-Day. Please stand for your Pledge of Allegiance.